At my retirement party, my brother stood up and said, "Since you won't need your savings, you should give them to me." Everyone laughed until he pulled out a fake will. The lawyer smiled and said, "Actually, let me show you the real one." My brother's smug face instantly turned to panic. That night was supposed to be a celebration. 40 years of work, long nights, stress, and sacrifice, finally behind me. I was retiring. The company had put together a nice dinner at a banquet hall in downtown Chicago. My co-workers, old friends, and family all showed up. Laughter, good food, a few drinks, the kind of send-off I had dreamed of. It was perfect. Until my brother ruined it. It started as a joke. At least, that's what I thought. My brother, Mark, stood up as people were clinking their glasses. He raised his hands for attention and gave a little smirk, the kind he always had when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. "Well," he said, "since you're retiring and, won't really need all that money anymore, I think it's only fair you give it to me." People chuckled. A few even clapped like he was doing some kind of comedy bit. I gave a polite smile and took a sip of my drink. Then he pulled out the papers. "I figured we'd make it official," he continued, waving a thick stack of documents in the air. "So, I went ahead and drafted this will for you. Saves you the trouble, you know." The laughter died down. Some nervous shifting in chairs. The room got quiet. I stared at him, waiting for him to say, "Just kidding." But he didn't. He stepped forward and placed the papers in front of me. "Just sign right here," he said, pointing at the dotted line. "I'll take good care of it." I looked down. It wasn't just a joke. It was an actual document. A will. And in it, he had named himself as the sole inheritor of everything I had worked for. My pension. My savings. My house. Everything. I should probably explain some things about Mark. He was the youngest of us. Our parents' favorite, spoiled rotten from the start. He never had to work hard for anything. While I was working after school to help pay bills, he was getting brand new bikes and video game consoles. While I put myself through college with part-time jobs and scholarships, Mark partied, dropped out, and moved back home. He was always between jobs, but somehow had the newest phone, the nicest clothes. And when our parents passed, I took care of the funeral costs while he took their car and whatever jewelry he could grab. Still, I never thought he would stoop this low. I picked up the papers and flipped through them, my hands tightening with each page. He had even forged a signature at the bottom, attempting to make it look like I had already agreed. The audacity. The sheer, mind-blowing audacity. Then, from the other end of the room, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. My lawyer stood up. Now, I hadn't told Mark, or anyone, really, that I had already drafted my real will. And I certainly hadn't told anyone that I had updated it just a month before. But my lawyer, James, knew. And from the way he smiled as he walked over, I knew something was about to go down. James reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "Actually," he said, "let me show you the real one." Mark's face drained of color. The room was dead silent. I swear you could hear the sound of his breath catching in his throat. James laid the real will on the table, flipping through the pages with careful precision. "As you can see," he said, "this was properly signed, dated, and notarized." He turned to Mark. "Unlike whatever it is you have there." Mark's hands shook as he grabbed his own document, flipping through it as if he could somehow make it real by just looking at it harder. You can't be serious," he stammered. "This has to be a mistake." James didn't even look at him. He was addressing the room now, speaking clearly and confidently. "This will has already been filed and recognized as legally binding," he said. "And in it, my client has made it very clear how his assets will be distributed." Mark swallowed hard. "And what does it say?" James smiled again. "Not a single cent goes to you." The air got heavy. People shifted uncomfortably. Mark let out a nervous chuckle, trying to play it off, but there was no hiding the sweat forming on his forehead. "Well, that's fine," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I was just joking, anyway." No one laughed. James leaned in, his voice dropping just enough to make it personal. "Forgery is a crime, Mark. I swear." Mark's knees almost buckled. He quickly grabbed his fake will off the table, clutching it to his chest like it was a lifeline. All right, he muttered. "No harm done, right? Just a little joke, that's all." I stared at him. This man, my own brother, had tried to steal everything from me. And now, when caught, he wanted to play it off like it was nothing? I wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Mark looked like a trapped animal. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one said a word. The only sound was the clinking of glasses and hushed whispers. Then, without warning, he snapped. "You know what?" he spat, shoving his fake will into his coat. "This is why no one in this family likes you. You've always been selfish. Always acting like you're better than everyone else." I stayed seated, just watching him. I wasn't about to give him the reaction he wanted. "You had everything handed to you," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Mom and Dad bailed you out every time you messed up, and now you're sitting on a pile of money while I struggle." A few gasps. Someone murmured, "Is he serious? Struggle?" Mark had never worked for anything in his life. He burned through every handout he got, borrowed money from family without paying it back, and somehow always had the latest gadgets. I wasn't going to let him rewrite history. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm. "I worked for everything I have, Mark. You could have done the same." His face twisted with rage, but before he could say anything else, James, my lawyer, spoke up. "Actually," James said, flipping through his folder again, "there's something else we should talk about." Mark turned to him. "What now?" James pulled out another set of papers and laid them on the table. "Do you recognize these?" Mark stepped closer, squinting at the documents. Then his face went from angry to pale. That's nothing," he mumbled. James nodded. "Really? Because these show bank transfers, large sums of money taken from your parents' estate after they passed. Money that was supposed to be split between you and your brother." More murmurs in the crowd. Some of my older relatives started whispering to each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. I clenched my fists under the table. I had suspected something was off when our parents' estate was settled, but I never had proof. Until now. James continued. "After some digging, I found out that Mark here took more than his fair share. In fact, he drained several accounts completely, making it look like there wasn't much left for anyone else. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. The funeral, the lawyer fees, the house maintenance, I had paid for all of it out of my own pocket, thinking our parents hadn't left much behind. Meanwhile, Mark had been siphoning their savings behind my back. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "Mark," I said, my voice steady, "is this true?" He shook his head frantically. No, this is a mistake. I don't know where he got that from." James sighed, adjusting his glasses. "We got it from the bank. Your name is all over the withdrawals." A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "You stole from your own family?" It was my cousin, David. He had always been neutral when it came to Mark and me, but right now, the disappointment in his voice was clear. Mark's hands balled into fists. "I didn't steal. That money was mine, too." James shook his head. "Not all of it. And the law doesn't agree with you." Mark's breathing grew heavy. His eyes darted toward the exit. He was looking for a way out. And that's when the real twist hit. James reached into his folder one last time and pulled out a letter. He slid it across the table toward me. "This," he said, "was found when we looked into your parents' accounts." I picked it up and unfolded it. My heart nearly stopped. It was a letter from my mother. A handwritten note, dated just weeks before she passed. My hands trembled as I read the words. "If you're reading this, then the truth has come out. I didn't know how to tell you while I was alive, but you deserve to know. Mark has been taking money behind your back. We didn't want to believe it at first, but the bank confirmed it. We hoped he would stop. He never did." I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept reading. "Please don't let him fool you. He will try. I only hope you find out before it's too late." Tears burned at the edges of my eyes. I looked up at Mark, who was now completely frozen. He must have known about this letter. That's why he was so desperate. That's why he had tried to fake a will. He knew the truth would eventually come out, and he had been trying to secure my assets before it did. The room was dead quiet. Everyone was watching. Mark licked his lips. That doesn't mean anything." I stood up. "It means everything." And for the first time in his life, Mark had no words. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked around the room, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. The truth was out. But I wasn't done with him yet. James, my lawyer, cleared his throat. Actually, there's one more thing. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Mark turned to him, his face now full of panic. What else could you possibly have? James sighed, flipping through the folder until he found another document. A legal complaint, he said. Filed just yesterday. Mark's face twisted in confusion. A complaint? Against who? James locked eyes with him. Against you. A stunned silence. Then, James continued, the bank records we uncovered show more than just money being taken from your parents' estate. They also show fraudulent loans taken out in their name, loans that were never paid back. I felt my stomach drop. This was news to me too. James looked at me. Your parents had no idea, but before they passed, Mark had taken out multiple loans using their names as guarantors. He used their social security numbers, their credit history, and their good standing to secure large sums of money. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mark's face turned an ugly shade of red. That's a lie. James ignored him. The unpaid balances accrued penalties. By the time your parents passed, the debt had become so large that their remaining assets were almost completely wiped out covering it. That's why there was barely anything left in their accounts. I gritted my teeth. So they died thinking they were broke. James nodded grimly. Mark, now sweating bullets, slammed his hands on the table. This is ridiculous. You can't prove any of this. James calmly slid another document forward. Actually, we can. Mark snatched it up, eyes scanning the page. His face crumpled. What is this? He whispered. James adjusted his glasses. That's the official report from the fraud investigation. Mark's hands started shaking. Fraud envies, no. No, no, no. This isn't happening. James continued, after seeing the suspicious transactions, the bank flagged them and launched a quiet investigation. They contacted us when they confirmed that the loans were fraudulent. And since your parents are no longer here, guess who that leaves responsible? Mark staggered back. No, this isn't fair. I didn't mean to, James cut him off. You committed financial fraud, Mark. And now, the bank is pressing charges. The room erupted. My relatives, once hesitant, now looked at Mark with open disgust. You stole from your own parents, my aunt hissed. How could you do that to your own family, another cousin said. Mark took a step back. His breathing was shallow. His eyes darted between James and me, then to the crowd, then to the exit. And then, he made the dumbest move of all. He ran. He bolted toward the door like a man on fire, pushing past tables and knocking over chairs. Someone yelped as their drink spilled. But he didn't make it far. Two uniformed officers stepped through the entrance just as Mark lunged for the exit. Mark Benson, one of them called out. Mark skidded to a stop, his eyes wide with terror. The officer held up a piece of paper. We have a warrant for your arrest. Mark tried to backpedal, but the second officer was already moving. In 2 quick steps, they grabbed him and twisted his arms behind his back. No! No! Mark screamed. You can't do this. This is my brother's fault. I crossed my arms and watched as they cuffed him. Actually, I said, this is all you. Mark thrashed, but there was nothing he could do now. As they dragged him out of the banquet hall, he screamed, I'm your brother. You can't do this to me. But I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching as my biggest headache, my lifelong burden, was finally taken away. For the first time in years, I felt free. And the retirement party? Well, it got a whole lot better after that. The room stayed silent long after Mark was dragged out in cuffs. No one knew what to say. My brother, who had tried to steal everything from me, who had lied and cheated our own parents, was finally getting what he deserved. Then, slowly, people started to murmur. A few whispered to each other. Someone laughed nervously. And then my cousin David, still holding his drink, raised his glass and said, well, that was the best retirement party entertainment I've ever seen. The whole room burst into laughter. The tension snapped, and suddenly, people were clapping me on the back, shaking their heads, muttering, unbelievable, and, you dodged a bullet. Someone even ordered another round of drinks to celebrate Mark's early retirement, from freedom. But for me, the night wasn't over yet. The real revenge Mark thought his nightmare ended with his arrest. He was wrong. See, the fraud investigation wasn't just about my parents' estate. James, my lawyer, had been digging deeper. Turns out, Mark hadn't only stolen from family. He had scammed a lot of people, old friends, ex-girlfriends, even his former landlords. He had a habit of taking loans he never intended to pay back, bouncing checks, and making promises he never kept. And thanks to his arrest, all those people finally came forward. Over the next few months, more cases were filed against him. Civil lawsuits. More fraud charges. Even the IRS got involved when it turned out he hadn't paid taxes in years. The state seized what little assets he had left, which wasn't much. His car? Repossessed. His credit cards? Frozen. Any money he had hidden? Taken to pay back debts. And just when Mark thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Because of the fake will stunt, James helped me file a separate lawsuit against him, for attempted fraud and forgery. Since he had tried to legally steal from me, I had every right to pursue damages. And I did. I won. The court ordered Mark to pay me a ridiculous amount of money for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. Of course, he didn't have the money. But that wasn't my problem. Mark was left broke. Homeless. No car. No credit. No way to scam his way out of trouble. And then, the final nail in his coffin, prison time. He tried to get a plea deal, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The bank fraud alone was enough for several years behind bars, and with everything else stacked against him, the judge wasn't feeling generous. The last time I saw Mark, he was standing in court, wearing an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his public defender. His once smug, entitled face was pale and hollow. When the judge handed down his 7-year sentence, Mark finally broke. He turned to me, begging. "Please," he whimpered. "Please, don't let them do this. We're family." I just stared at him. "You stopped being family the moment you stole from Mom and Dad." And with that, they took him away. The aftermath after Mark was locked up, life got a whole lot better. I enjoyed my retirement without the stress of him constantly asking for money. No more phone calls begging for favors. No more fake apologies. Just peace. His prison sentence gave me time to finally sort out my parents' estate properly. With James' help, I was able to recover some of what Mark had taken. Not everything, but enough to restore some dignity to their legacy. And the best part? Mark never recovered. Even after he got out years later, he had nothing left. No money. No friends. No home. No one willing to give him another chance. His name was ruined. His record made sure he couldn't get a decent job. Last I heard, he was couch surfing at some distant acquaintance's place, still bitter, still blaming everyone but himself. But that wasn't my problem anymore. Because while Mark was struggling to pick up the pieces of his self-destroyed life, I was enjoying mine. Retired. Debt-free. Surrounded by people who actually cared about me. And completely free of him. The best revenge? Living well. And that's exactly what I did.